So we are going to jump into lesson 4.1, which is on modeling fractions. So right now, open up your Springboard books to page 45 and read these two learning targets for today as I read along. The first one is to model fractions graphically, and then the second learning target is to convert between fractions, decimals, and percents. For this video, we are only going to focus on the second learning target. This one here, I'm going to teach either in a separate video or in class. So right now, I want to draw our attention to our new LEQ. We just finished up the previous activity, so this is a new LEQ. And the LEQ is how can I define, recognize, and compare rational numbers in multiple representations. Go ahead and underline multiple representations. Going back to our activity for today, the representations that we're looking at are the fractions, decimals, and percents. So these are the multiple representations. Okay. And this is useful because a lot of times people say like, oh, I had 50% off. But then 50% off, so say you have a $20 shirt and they say, well, I got it at 50% off. Well, you need to know that 50% off is the same thing as a half off, which would be the same thing as a certain like amount in decimal and dollar format. So converting between the fractions and the decimals and percentages is used a lot in everyday life. And that's just one example. So money here, so like money is just one example of how this would be used. There are lots of different examples. See if you can think of some examples on your own of when do we use fractions, decimals, and percents. Share those examples with your partner. Okay, great. So now we're going to jump into the lesson. Before we do, it's important to review our decimal place values. So as you know, this here is the decimal in a number. And then when we work our way here, the number gets larger. So like this would be 392,158,574. So this is our ones place, tens, hundreds. Then, and these are separated by a comma. Then over here, we have our decimals. So these are whole numbers and these are our decimals. Our decimals, the 6 is what we call the tenths place. The 5 is what we call the hundredths place. And the 7 is what we call the thousandths place. So if I were to write this 6, so the decimal as a fraction, the reason I call it a tenths place is because it would be 6 over 10 or 6 out of 10. Same thing, the reason that the 5 is called the hundredths place is if I only had that 5, just like they're showing you right here, I would make that 5 hundredths or 5 over 100. So what do you think looking at this right here? If it is 7 in the thousandths place, what would that number be over in the form of a fraction? How would you write that number as a fraction? Great, you should have 7 thousandths, just like your notes have. So right now I want you to turn and talk, and I want you to talk about how does the name of the place value correlate with the fraction? So how does name of place value relate to fraction? For example, if my 6/10 was 6 over 10, my 7/10 would be 7 over 10. Nope, that's wrong. My 6/10 would be 6 over 10. My 500ths would be 5 out of 100. My 7/10 would be the equivalent of 7D, 7 sets of 10. All right, so now we're going to go ahead and we're going to move on to our objective for the day. So now we're going to work on actually converting between fractions, decimals, and percents. The second part of your notes has this handy dandy example in it. With this example, I'm going to walk through how to use this, but this is a tool for you to use. All right, so this is a tool for you to use throughout the rest of the lesson. So let's teach you how to use this tool. This here is what I call a conversion triangle. So we have our three different parts. We have our fractions, we have our percents, and we have our decimals. We have our three different parts. So now within those parts, I can go from any format. So say I start with that number. I start with 3/10, and I want to convert it into a percent. So I'm going to follow the arrow. So if I start here, I'm going to follow the arrow that points to where I want to go. So in this case here, I want to follow this arrow. Now I'm going to look at the stuff above it. Okay, I'm going to look at the stuff above it to see what to do. So here it says divide the numerator, and that top number right there is the numerator, by the denominator, and move the decimal point 2 spots to the right. So if I divide my numerator, so I do 3 divided by 10, and you should be doing this as I'm going through this too. So 3 divided by 10, I can't do that. I can't have 3 and make a group of 10 out of it. It doesn't work that way. So I have to add this decimal and decimal there, and I have to add a 0. 10 now goes into 30, so now my number is 30. 10 goes into 30 3 times. So 3 divided by 10 is that 0.3, and it says to move the decimal 2 spots to the right. So if I take this decimal format, I move it 1, I move it 2. So to go from a decimal to a percent, I divided my numerator by my denominator. I got 3/10, and then I move that decimal 2 spaces to the right. And then I go ahead and I just add that little percent symbol behind it. I could also think of a percent. So per means out of, and cent means cien. So this means cent means 100. So out of 100. So the other way I actually could have thought about this is I could have thought about it as if it's 3 out of 10, what is it out of 100? So per 100. 10 times 10 is 100, so 3 times 10 would also give me 30. Either way, my answer is 30. So now, say I was given, instead of being given 3/10, say I was given 30%, and I wanted to go from percent to the decimal. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to follow this. I'm starting with my 30%, and I am moving my way to, I'm moving to the decimal. So I'm going in this direction. So I'm following this arrow right there. So with that being said, if I'm following this arrow down here, I'm going to read what's directly above that arrow. And in this case here, it says move the decimal point 2 spots to the left. Well, if I'm looking at this number right here, I don't see a decimal point, but it's there. Even if you don't see it, it's there. It is right behind the whole number. So think about it this way. Having $5 like that, even though there's no decimal point, is the same thing as adding a decimal and the 2 zeros. Okay, so it's just, even if it's not written, we assume the decimal is there. So to go from a percent to a decimal, I move the decimal point 2 spots to the left. 1, 2. My new decimal placement is right there, so it moved from here on over. So now I have my decimal of 0.3, which I could also say is 3/10. Great, easy enough. So I've gone from a fraction to a percent, I've gone from a percent to a decimal. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go from a decimal to a fraction. So once again, I'm following this arrow, following that arrow right on up, and I'm going to read this. So this says, put the number after the decimal point in the numerator spot. The place value of the decimal goes in the denominator. Simplify the fraction. All right, so this is where our previous learning kind of comes into play. So this is where this chart comes into play. So when I see this number, when I see 3/10, okay, when I see 3/10, 0.3, it is in the tenths spot. So I'm going to take my number and I'm going to put it in my numerator spot. Remember, numerator goes on top. And then because it's in the tenth spot, I'm going to put a 10 on the bottom. And that's how we got back up to the fraction 3/10. Okay? And you see, you can kind of move around this triangle. You can go ahead and move around this triangle any direction. Just follow the word above those arrows. All right, so right now, here's what I want you to do. If Spanish is your main language, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to convert the chart to words you understand in Spanish. That definitely means use Google Translate. Okay, for example, you may need to look up the Spanish word for left. You may need to look up the Spanish word for right. But I want you to make this chart your own in a language that you can understand. All right, the second thing that I want you to do is I want you to explain the chart in your own words to a partner. Okay, explain the chart in your own words to a partner. How does it work? How do you use it? Specifically, how do you use it? Okay, how do you use that chart? Okay, so right now you're going to need to push pause and you're going to need to do these two items. When you come back and you push play, we will take a look at page 48 at the Try These A on page 48. Okay, go ahead and hit pause. All right, great. So let's go ahead and let's practice this. So here, convert the following decimals into fractions. Simplify each fraction. So if you remember, for this here, you have to know how to read these decimals. So this has 2 decimal places. So we would say 59 hundredths. So what I would do here is I would put 59, and because my last decimal place is in that second spot, I'm going to put it all over 100. Same thing here. This says 4/10. Okay, 4/10. So again, I'm going to take my 4 and I'm going to put it over, you got it, 10, 4/10. And I'm using, when I know what they're over, I'm actually using this chart right here. So that's my tenths, that's my hundredths, that's my thousandths. So again, you guessed it, for our last one here, this would be 235 thousandths. So again, I have 235 over 1,000. Now, if you know how to, go ahead and simplify. I'm going to show you very briefly how to simplify. However, I really just want you to focus on identifying the place value. I do not want you to get stuck on simplifying. So just watch this, but please don't be stressed about this. So 59 and 100, they don't have any common factors, so I leave them just how they are. 4 and 10, they're both even, so I know I can divide out 2 from both of them. When I do whatever I do to the numerator, I have to do to the denominator. So 4 divided by 2 is 2, and 10 divided by 2 is 5. Once I have this new fraction, they don't have any common factors, meaning I can't divide out the same thing. So once I have that simplified fraction, it's good. Now here, I see that they both end in a 5. So I can divide out my 5. Again, whatever I do to my numerator or my top number, I have to do to my denominator or my bottom number. So 235 divided by 5 is 47, and 1,000 divided by 5 is 200. Once I get to this point, I don't have a common factor or common thing to divide out, so I'm done. Once I get to where I have no common number to divide out, then I'm done. All right, I want you right now to turn and talk, and I want you to answer these two questions. How did we convert from decimal to fraction? And how did we know whether to put, specifically, how did we know to use 10? How did we know to use 100? How did we know to use 1,000 as our denominator or as our bottom number? Then, if you want a challenge, I want you to explain how to simplify. Okay? Otherwise, don't worry about that just now. I want you to really focus on that first one. So once again, go ahead and pause and talk to your partner about those two prompts. And then when you're ready, push play. All right, great. So now we're going to go ahead and we're going to work through a couple of these problems. The first thing I want to note is if I put a star next to it, that means that it's a challenge. So the star equals the challenge. I want you to save those challenges for the end. So if you finish before everybody else, then come back to those challenges. But for right now, we're just going to go ahead and we're going to try to do a couple of these on our own. So right now, let's see. You remember to use your triangle. Use that triangle right there. Okay, that triangle that's in your notes to go from one to the other. I showed you with the example, but like if it gives you the decimal form, so here, if it gives you that decimal form, then I want you to start with the decimal form. So if it gives you the decimal form and it's asking and you're trying to figure out the fraction form, clear some space here, then you would do exactly what it says here. Put the number after the decimal point in the numerator spot, place the value of the decimal in the denominator. That would give you the fraction. And then here you could go from decimal, you could follow this arrow to the percent. So move the decimal 2 spots to the right, 1, 2. So again, if it gives you that decimal form, just follow your triangle. Follow your triangle to go to the fraction and to the percent. So right now, go ahead, pause. I want you to try these on your own. Okay, and then I want you to push play. Only when done. Only when done. Actually, let's do this. I want you to try these on your own, and I want you to do the first 3. First 3. Then I want you to push play and check your answers. Okay, so you should have these as your answer, and this should be simplified. So if you had, let's see, if you had 2 over 10, well, it doesn't have to be simplified. That may be why you got a different answer. So if you had 2 over 10, because you would say this, that is the tenths place, then that would simplify. You would factor out 2, and you would factor out 2, which would give you 1 and would give you 5. Same thing here. If you had 25 over 100, because tenths, the second place is the 100ths place, you would, again, this time you could actually factor out 25. Just think of it as quarters. If there's 100 cents in a dollar, a quarter of that is 1/4. All right, so great. Now we said that one's a challenge and that one's a challenge. I want you to do this one, this one. I want you to do the rest of them that are not challenges. Okay, so go ahead and work on them right now, and you can work on them with a partner. So you're doing the ones that I've not recognized as a challenge, and then you can push play, and you can show your answers or check your answers once you push play. All right, so the rest of yours should look like this right here. Once again, I'll go ahead and I'm going to put in what it would be if you had not simplified it, and I'll show you kind of how that would have simplified. We didn't do that one. Again, you can factor out 25. And then there, they gave you the fraction. All right, so now go ahead and try the challenge ones. Try the challenge ones and kind of see what happens. And then push play. All right, great. So here, you'll notice that when you did 1 divided by 3, that you just got 3 and 3 and 3 and 3 and on and on and on and on and on. This is what we call a repeating decimal. And it's repeating because it never, 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 never ends. So instead of writing 3 for the rest of our lives, we have some annotations or some symbols to help us show that it's a repeating decimal. So in order to do that, we would just put a little line above the 3 to show that it repeats. Same thing, when you did 2 divided by 3, show you real quick. So here, it goes in there 6 times, that's 18, so you have your 6. 18. So then you have your 2, bring down to 0, it goes in 6 times. Again, you can kind of see what's happening. So again, we would call this one repeating as well. And it is, as a decimal, it would just be 6 repeating. So you would have that little line above the 6 to show that they go on and on and on and on and on and on. These other decimals, they end or they terminate. So terminate means end. So we call these other decimals that do not go on and on and on and on and on forever, we call them terminating decimals. So great. So if you watch this part, right now I want you to talk to your partner. What is the difference between repeating decimals and terminating decimals? Great. At this point right now, I want you to summarize your notes and please ask any questions that you don't understand. Ask any questions that you don't understand.